Hello everyone, I'm Veetika. I'm the Senior Product Designer for Pipeline Execution Team, and today I'm going to give a summary of the UX scorecard activity that I was working on, which was around the feature set that is associated with variables in GitLab CI. Now, why do we conduct UX scorecard exercise? For us, it's a way to identify and score the usability of an experience in our product based on a set of heuristics, and we also use scorecards to gain an understanding of how our users are interacting with our product and what are the areas where we can still make an improvement. Now, talking about the process, we start off with selecting a jobs to be done, which is closely associated with the category of feature set. Then we lay down the journey map that user have to follow to perform the task, which is associated with that JTPD. Then we use our heuristics to calculate a score for those jobs to be done. And finally, based on the heuristic evaluation and the observations that we make in the process, we make certain recommendations that we work on. All right. So the job to be done that was selected in this particular scenario is control scope for CI/CD variables. This says that when architecting pipeline configuration, I want to be able to define the variable so that it is dynamically inherited across all hierarchies of a repository, an upstream or downstream pipeline in order to perform complex operations without scripting those tasks to save time across repositories. So using this one single JTBD, we are touching upon two scenarios, which are the first one is that of a monorepo, where users might just have to pass a variable from a parent to a child pipeline. And also the multi-project scenarios where users might have a requirement to pass a variable from an upstream to a downstream pipeline. And the projects which are hosting the upstream and downstream might be very disconnected projects, like they are not a part of the same repository. The personas that we zeroed down upon for this exercise were, the first was that of a DevOps engineer and the second was software developer. So we interviewed 5 users overall, and 3 out of them, out of the 5 were DevOps engineers and 2 were software developers. 4 were external recruitments and 1 was internal. Now, there are no hard steps in terms of how users are supposed to start on the UI and how they're supposed to proceed with the task, because this is the task which is associated with this JTBD cannot be performed solely with the UI in place. So there are certain changes that they have to make to the YAML file. There are certain syntaxes that they have to follow by referring to the documentation, but we were able to zero them down into 4 steps, like the 4 steps that users have to ensure that they follow so that they are able to successfully accomplish the task. The first is convert variables into a transferable format. They have to ensure that the variable is in a format that could be, in fact, transferred to a downstream or child pipeline. Then triggering the downstream pipeline from the upstream pipeline. The third is from the downstream pipeline side. So this is all about ensuring that whatever is being passed down from the upstream pipeline is actually received on the downstream project side. Then lastly, whatever is the purpose of inheriting that particular variable from upstream, that is accomplished in a proper way. For example, if you want to output the value of that variable, or maybe just use it in some operation, you're able to do that smoothly. Now, based on our observations, there was an experience map that we have put together. And what I'll do is I'll now, through a project which is in place, I'll take you through this whole process of the process that we have mapped here in the experience map, and talk about what are the places where we feel that we have an opportunity to improve. Okay, so we have this project in place, which was shared with the participants of the task as well. And here, and the task that we are here to perform is, we have 2 pipelines that we are in charge of, the upstream and the downstream pipeline. And this particular project hosts the upstream pipeline. Now, what we want to do is we want to regenerate the API docs every time there's a release in the main project. And this is the main project that we're looking at. So we want to make sure that the auto-generated docs are tagged with the same version as the release. Okay, so let's go and have a look at the GitLab CI YAML file, which is in place. Okay, so we have certain stages defined for us, and then at the end we can see that there are a couple of variables which are provided already. So let's see what is it that we can do with this. Now there's a section in the right now it's clear that the two pipelines which are in question, they're not in the same repository. So this is mostly a multi-project pipeline scenario. So what we'll do is we'll go to the multi-project pipeline documentation page and try to figure out like what are the steps that we need to take next. So coming to this section, this is passing Cicd variables to a downstream pipeline, and this is probably what we have to follow for this exercise. Now let's compare. We have tests, then we have variables defined, and let's see what the doc asks us to do here. So here it says that you might want to pass Cicd variables down a downstream pipeline. You can do that using variables keyword, just like you would when you are defining a regular job. And here in the example, we are seeing that the variable which they are using, which is environment staging in this case, has been defined using the variables keyword in the same job that is kind of triggering the downstream pipeline. So I'll go back and see like what are the changes that I have to make here. So probably if I open pipeline editor, then what I can do is I can just go ahead, create a new, or maybe just create a new test job. Test job is already there, so probably test one. And since I'm using this version number, so I can just get rid of this. Maybe this is not used anywhere. But right now, I'm not very sure. Like, I have this release job already defined. Could I just go ahead and use the variable, like put the variable inside this job itself? Would it work? Like, is there a problem? Let's say if I delete this job altogether, and then what I can do is I can put the trigger here, right? Like I'll go ahead and I'll just put the trigger keyword and make sure that it is valid. Yeah. Variable stage environment two spaces. So it says that the CI configuration is invalid and says job release config key contains unknown key trigger. So maybe this could be because, maybe I should just specify like, and that's going to work. But I'm still getting this error, so I'm not really able to understand why am I getting this error. Maybe let's try removing this. Oh, now it's valid. So it was not really presented anywhere in the documentation that I couldn't use a script in the same job where I am putting the trigger, but that's how it finally worked. So, and that's the change that I have to make here. And the pipeline is running, so I'll go ahead, I'll go and run a pipeline and see what happens next. So I can see that this pipeline has started to run, and here it only gives me idea about what's happening in the pipeline of this repository, but it doesn't really tell me like what's going on with if the job in the downstream pipeline has been created at all. So that's probably a space that we can improve on, because unless I go to this pipeline here and okay, I see the release job has been created, but it has not started to run. Okay, now it has completed and this has been created. I go here, I go to check. So the downstream pipeline is still running. Okay, now I need to wait for it to stop running to see whether or not whatever I had intended to do was accomplished. This says 5.0.0. Let's see if this is the value that I had put in the pipeline here. Yeah, that's correct. Now, while we are on the downstream pipeline, let's also go and have a look what's happening in the YAML file of the downstream. Oh, so we see that there was already a variable with the same name defined in the downstream as well, but I'm not very sure like why why the trigger variable was given a preference precedence over this variable defined in the downstream pipeline. So maybe we can give that a little more importance in the documentation. Okay, that was the first set of tasks. Now moving to another scenario here. And in this scenario, what's happening that I am playing the role of a software engineer at a startup. And my job is that I'm responsible for this upstream pipeline. And the test system in this upstream pipeline generates a set of credentials that I have to pass down to a downstream pipeline in order to allow the downstream pipeline to run some additional integration tests. Now this again, I can clearly see it's not just in a situation of a monorepo and these two projects are disconnected. So again, I would go to the documentation to see like, what am I supposed to do here? Should I just be passing them as variables? What are the other options that I have? So I see that there's something like it says with variable inheritance. It doesn't really tell me exactly like what are the situations in which I should be using this option versus the variables. But since this talks about environment variables and that's what I have to deal with in this particular scenario, I'll go ahead and have a look at it. So let's open the YAML file that has been provided here. So this one has a job defined, which is echoing credentials. Okay, so it's not very clear to me about what I should be doing with those variables. So if I go and take a look at the documentation, okay, so this is probably storing them as artifacts in a .env report. All right, so I will go ahead and add this here. And since we are using credentials.env, I will replace build.env with that. Now, it's not very clear whether or not I have to define these variables, like expose them in the Cicd project settings here. Like, do I have to expand them, do I have to add them here? This one only talks about like adding them as a like saving them inside .env, so it is bundled in a report. And the next is deploy stage. Okay, so maybe I don't have this already, a job to trigger. Oh wait, I do. So what I'll do is, since I think this is not a very crucial part of my exercise, I'll go ahead and replace So this is what I do. I choose the stage as deploy, and okay, maybe it should be to the downstream. And this is the project that I'm working with. So and for every time that I have to go and copy the URL for the upstream and downstream, I have to go to that project and pick it from the spar. If there was an easier way to do that, because that's something I have to do very often. Now it's not very clear, like when I'm triggering this, then how is this being sent? Because in the previous scenario, I was kind of I added the variable inside this job, so it kind of indicated that it maybe while triggering the downstream, it's going to be passed on. But right now here, what is happening, it's very unclear to me. Like, how would this report be transferred just by triggering? Okay, so let's commit changes. Well, it says there's an unknown key reports, so I need to check that. Okay, 2 spaces. Okay, now it's valid. All right. So now what I'll do is I'll go to the downstream pipeline to see what's happening here, like whether or not I would be able to get the credentials here. First, what I'll do is with whatever changes I've made to this first pipeline, I'll try running it. Okay, it's already running. This has completed. Now I'm hoping that this has been created and it will start running soon. Yes, it has started. Now if I go to the downstream pipeline to see what happens here. So I'm not very sure this is working as desired. So in our downstream pipeline, if we go and open the pipeline editor, so we are not getting a value from the previous pipeline because maybe nothing has been passed down yet. So let's see how can we ensure that. Okay, so it says that the test job in the downstream pipeline to inherit variables from with needs. So we have to use the keyword needs. The test job inherits the variables in the .env report and it can access the test job. So it says like if we use needs keyword, then the test job in the downstream would be able to inherit the variables in the .env report and it can access build version in the script. But do I really do I also have to maybe download the artifacts from the upstream before passing it down to downstream? Because right now there's no option to do that. There's not even a download. Like if we come here, build vars maybe. If you go to this job, there's no artifacts are present. So how would it be? Okay, let's try to do this. And Okay, so the configuration is valid, and let's commit this. Let's run a pipeline again to see what happens now. Was it committed, or did I make a change again? Okay, yeah, changes have been committed. All right. So let's look at the pipeline which is running. Again, as I said, there's no indication here from the pipeline overview page like what's happening on the downstream pipeline side. So it says that this succeeded, but was something really passed on to downstream? There's no clear indication. And even if we go and look at this visualization, the graph, the pipeline graph, it talks about that a certain job has triggered downstream, but the exchange that has happened is not very clear. Okay, so we have received the input from the upstream pipeline and it's done now. And that should be all. So that's the process that we talked about, like we touched upon two different scenarios, two different ways of doing it. But the overall steps that one has to ensure in the journey, they remain the same. And there are certain opportunities that we can still look at. For example, we can make the docs more we can add more example to the doc. So it is right now what's happening is it kind of looks like it is absolute, like this is a part, this is exactly how it should be, but this is more like an example. It can be replaced with whatever variables you're using, but that doesn't come across very clearly here. So that's an area that we can improve on. And similarly, if we can have more than one kind of example on the documentation, that would be also great. So right now, the documentation does tell about like what is the right way of doing it, but it does not emphasize on the don'ts. For example, I did not know that we cannot use script here in the same job where we're using to trigger the downstream, and that kind of breaks the syntax. So that was something that wasn't understandable. And similarly, other changes that we can see, maybe how the trigger downstream should be named. Yeah, like what are the like constraints around naming these jobs and stages? Is there something that we need to be more careful about? And right now, when we're using this method, like using variables to pass down variables from upstream to downstream, that is kind of happening automatically, but it is not registered anywhere that we do not need to do anything manually in this situation, and that just using this particular syntax, this passing down a variable will take care of itself, and nothing actually needs to be added to the downstream side to receive something that's being passed on from the upstream. So some more improvements on the doc side. And yeah, and that should be all. Otherwise, towards the time of when users are accomplishing this action, they are very delighted to know that something like of this sort really exists. And it's a very useful feature, but how we are presenting it and how we are like talking about it in the documentation needs to be worked on a little bit. Thank you so much.